September 11, 1922, New York Times. 30 swirling barges in swift river tide put boats to flight. Crowded ferry and yachts in path of runaway craft narrowly escape. Race to reach safety. Loaded coal carriers torn from moorings imperil scores of East River vessels. Radio warns big steamers. Police and fireboats and railroad tugs work for hours to recapture drifting fleet. 30 to 40 heavily laden coal barges swept from their moorings at East River piers at ebb tide yesterday by a swift flood of waters from the Hell Gate Channel, swirled down the river in a wild jam, smashing and ripping one another and imperiling scores of large and small boats in the narrow West Channel between Manhattan Island and Blackwell's Island. The rushing wall of danger started down the river just a few minutes before several large passenger boats were due to steam up, and policemen along the riverfront frantically flashed every steamboat company they could remember to tell them of the uncontrollable fleet of water juggernauts sweeping through the narrow channels. The rushing wall of danger started down the river just a few minutes before several large passenger boats were due to steam up, and policemen along the riverfront frantically flashed every steamboat company they could remember to tell them of the uncontrollable fleet of water juggernauts sweeping through the narrow channels. Many of the big boats were called by radio apparatus to duck their noses quickly against the shore so that no casualties to passenger craft were reported. 2 small yachts cruising up the west channel of the river ran into the tangle of battering boats, but by swift maneuvers managed to turn tail and flee around the southern end of Blackwell's Island, and thence up the river in the east channel. Narrow escape for ferryboat. The ferryboat Bronx, plying between East 86th Street and Blackwell's Island in the service of the Department of Public Welfare, with a heavy load of passengers, had a narrow escape from serious damage and escaped only through quick and bold handling by Captain Harry Daniels. When his boat was hardly across the channel, Captain Daniels saw the wall of heavy boats rushing down the tide, and he speeded up to avoid their battering ram impact. He saw that the wall of danger was so wide that it would be impossible for him to tie up at the end of the pier as usual, and he forced his boat in behind the pier and waited for the tumbling jam to pass down the river. Even at that, he avoided danger by a hair's breadth, because the right wing of the jam hardly missed crushing his craft as he squeezed behind the pier. Several other smaller boats narrowly escaped and avoided the dangerous jam only by the dexterous handling of their pilots and the good operation of their power plants. Deputy Chief Edward Worth of the Marine Division of the Fire Department, who rushed up the river in a fast launch to direct the work of capturing the wild boats, said that it was remarkable that no craft were sunk in the jam. Not only are the channels narrow in this part of the river, but jagged ledges and rocks poke knife edges through the shallow waters, and pilots have to be careful even when they have clear river before them. Passenger boats fortunate. He and other rescuers pointed out that if any of the big passenger boats had encountered the coal barges running amok through the narrow East River channel, the consequences might have been serious, with damage of large loss of life and property. The channel there is so narrow and full of ledges that it would be a hard job for a pilot to turn a big boat around, even if he had plenty of time for the task and no danger rushing upon him. How some of the barges missed dangerous Mill Rock midway between Manhattan and the Astoria shore and other danger points in the channel was a mystery to Deputy Chief Worth, but examination last night revealed that the only damage to the barges was a few holes which they had poked in the sides of each other in the jam. A few pierheads also were crumpled along the river's edge, but the damage will be only a few $1,000s. The trouble started at the foot of East 96th Street, where more than 30 coal barges laden with about $1 million worth of soft coal had been tied up on Saturday after they had been pulled from the Jersey shore by tugboats. Each of the heavy boats held from 600 to 1,100 tons of coal. They were owned by the Burns Brothers Coal Company and various other distributors. Arthur Kenny, pilot of the fireboat Cornelius W. Lawrence, usually tied up at the foot of East 99th Street, saw one of the heavy boats break loose in the ebbing tide shortly after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and immediately he notified Captain Francis H. Kiernan, who started the craft in pursuit. Firemen Felix McCarthy and John McCauley managed to get a line on the boat as she twisted and turned in the rushing waters, and the Lawrence started back up the river to tie up the captured boat. Meets rushing barges. When the Lawrence was about opposite East 93rd Street with her captured boat, she ran into a string of rushing barges, all tied together like links of sausages in groups of 8 to 10 boats. They had worked loose from their moorings in the heavy tide and had started down the river. Lines tying the boats together also parted. The Lawrence sent up distress signals in the hope that tugboats would respond and help tie up the drifting boats, and managed to get 12 of the boats linked together and maneuvered toward the shore. Fearing that the boats might break loose again and wreck themselves upon the rocks or in crashes with steamboats, Captain Tiernan ordered all women and children from the barges to the fireboat. Nearly a dozen persons were taken aboard the Lawrence. After tying up these 12 boats, the Lawrence started for 9 others. While she was chasing these fugitives, the original string of 12 pulled their lines loose in the heavy tide and again started down the river. Swirling and turning in dangerous circles, the boats caught other coal barges from piers further down the stream, so that the fleet swept on in ever-growing menace to other shipping as the number of uncontrolled boats was increased. Ends of piers were crumpled and holes were smashed in the sides of the boats, but none sank. The siren of the Lawrence attracted many other municipal boats and railroad tugs to the work of clearing the river, and also called thousands of spectators to the Queensboro Bridge and pier ends, whence eyes were directed on the efforts of the pilots to put lines on the swinging coal barges. The fireboat William B. McClellan rushed from its post at Astoria to aid in the work, and the police boat Manhattan, in command of Inspector William Bailey, also came up. Railroad tugs dropped their tows, and their crews fought for hours in efforts to get the barges tied up, lest any of the big Sunday pleasure boats or the Boston and Providence steamers should fail to receive warning of the danger and take their usual courses through the channel. Both the Pachogue and the Kuchogue of the Long Island Railroad Company snared boats and tied them up. The Allentown of the Lehigh Valley Railroad, in command of Captain E. B. Ford, also dropped her tow and went to work. Tugs of the New Haven Road also worked, as did the tug commissioner of the Merritt and Chapman Derrick and Wrecking Company. So swiftly did the jam of boats rush in the ebb tide that the tugs had long and arduous work, because their skippers had to avoid being crushed by the wild boats, and also keep an eye out for the dangerous rocks and ledges jutting their ragged crests through the river's waters. Several of the boats were chased as far south as 22nd Street, where 6 were finally tied up at a pier there. 4 more were moored at 24th Street, 2 at 28th Street, 2 at 38th Street, and 2 at 31st Street. Captain Ford of the Allentown managed to drag a line of 7 into Newtown Creek, and then he hurried out to tie up others along the eastern shore of the river. Still another boat was reported sinking in the river, but neither the fire nor police department could verify that rumor. Policemen along the Manhattan waterfront and lifesavers at the volunteer station, at the Signet Club at West 84th Street, saw the danger to any big passenger boat that might be in the river and hurriedly broadcast warnings by telephone to the ship companies. Wireless transmission sets also sent out warnings on the wavelength used by the big broadcasting stations and the ships operating in the harbors. Peril that big boats escaped. "It was one of the most serious moments I have ever seen in this river," said Captain Ford of the Allentown. "Those heavy barges would have crushed a big passenger boat before a captain could get out of the way, and the ledges and narrow channels made them even more dangerous, because a captain might have to choose between crushing his ship on a ledge or a coal barge." With a crew of 5 men, Captain Ford tied up 9 of the boats. At first he towed 7 into Newtown Creek and 2 more later, among them the C. Scully, the Maltese 3, R. Killian, Arthur 1, John Collins, John Hickey, Lake Michigan, and the Cape Roman. He said he had been informed that some of the boats belonged to the Tracy Towing Line, Inc. of 1 Broadway. Nearly all of the boats had at least 1 man each upon them, but they were powerless to prevent the swirling of the craft. Many stood on the ends of the craft as they ran by the piers and attempted to lasso pier projections so that the boats might be tied up. Some of the ropes caught, but snapped under the strain of the tide, which, Captain Ford said, was ebbing at full strength during the worst of the fight with the boats. Many of the men on the boats also had their wives and children with them, and the firemen insisted upon taking them off as soon as they caught up with the boats in midstream. These families were returned to the boats after they had been tied up at the piers and all danger was past.